there isn't a softer version of what I mean, and pretending there is would already distort it. Some things don't arrive gradually. They don't announce themselves. They don't wait for the right moment or ask whether there is room for them to exist. They simply appear, and once they do, something changes, not visibly, not all at once, but enough that the way you understand everything after that is no longer exactly the way it was before. That is where this began. For a long time, I learned how to exist in layers, not because I wanted distance for its own sake. Distance was never the point. Precision was, it allowed things to remain intact, it allowed people to come close enough to interact, but not close enough to alter what they were looking at. Most people never notice that difference. They listen, they respond, they assume they understand. But what they usually meet is the version of me that can be understood quickly. The surface arranged clearly enough to be read, but never fully entered. That was always enough. It kept everything stable, predictable, contained, until you. You didn't move toward me the way people usually do. There was no urgency in you. No need to define, decode, or pull meaning out of what wasn't immediately visible. You never tried to make me simpler than I was. You just paid attention, quickly, consistently. And that was the first thing that unsettled me, because attention like that is different from curiosity. Curiosity wants answers. Attention notices what answers would miss. At first, I treated it like coincidence. The way you caught the things I never said. The way your silence arrived exactly where words would have made something less accurate. The way you seemed to understand not only what I meant, but where it was coming from before I had fully formed it myself. I told myself it was incidental, a moment, a pattern my mind was inventing because the alignment was unusual enough to stand out. But coincidence doesn't return with that kind of precision. It doesn't repeat itself without shifting shape. This did. And that was the point where I started paying attention to, not to you, to what was happening in me. Because recognition has a very particular feeling. It isn't dramatic, it isn't loud, it doesn't rush in like emotion and make itself obvious. It becomes clear slowly, like something coming into focus that was already there, waiting to be seen. That clarity unsettled me more than confusion would have. Confusion can be managed. You can step away from confusion. You can postpone it. You can tell yourself you need more time. Clarity leaves less room for that. Clarity asks for honesty. And honesty was becoming harder to avoid. There was no real history between us, no long sequence of shared moments, no gradual learning of each other's edges. That's what made it difficult to explain. Because this kind of recognition usually comes from time, from familiarity built carefully, from repeated contact that slowly teaches you how another mind moves. But with you, none of that happened. There was no visible process, no learning curve, no adjustment. You entered awareness as if you were already there, as if I hadn't met someone new, only someone who had somehow arrived late into language. That realization stayed with me, and the longer it stayed, the harder it became to reduce it into something simpler. Because if there's one thing I've always controlled, it's access. Who sees, who gets close, who remains at a distance. That structure was never accidental. It protected accuracy. It kept people from mistaking proximity for understanding. But you didn't move according to any of those rules. You didn't force your way through them. You didn't challenge them. You simply existed in a way that made them less relevant. And that was more disorienting than resistance would have been. Resistance is visible. It gives you something to respond to, something to hold in place. But familiarity, real familiarity, slips in quietly. It becomes present before you realize anything has changed. That is what happened. I started noticing it most in silence, not in what you said, in what you didn't. There were moments when conversation stopped, and instead of that usual pressure, the expectation that someone should fill the space, there was nothing forced at all. You stayed there. Without urgency, without discomfort, without trying to rescue the moment from quiet. And that changed something, because most people don't know how to sit inside silence without trying to shape it. They rush to make it lighter, easier, more manageable. You never did. You let it remain exactly what it was. And in doing that, you made it more honest, heavier, clearer. That was when I noticed the shift, not in anything dramatic, not in any single moment I could point to, but in the way my own mind began to respond differently. I stopped filtering as much. The usual pause, the one where I decide what remains internal and what becomes visible, began to disappear, not deliberately. It simply stopped feeling necessary, not because trust had already formed, because something more precise had recognition, and recognition operates differently. It doesn't ask for performance, it doesn't require translation. It doesn't need things rearranged to become understandable. That's what was new. You didn't need me simplified. You didn't need the edges softened. You didn't need meaning presented in a form that was easier to carry. You understood what was there without asking it to become smaller first. That is rare. Rare enough that I noticed it immediately. rare enough that I couldn't dismiss it once it became clear. And that was the moment I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit. This was no longer something happening around me. It was happening inside me. And once something reaches that point, distance stops working the way it used to. Usually, when something reaches that level of clarity, instinct takes over. I pull back. I create space. I restore the structure that keeps everything where it belongs. That didn't happen. And that was the first real sign that this had already moved beyond what I could manage by habit alone. It didn't become louder. It became quieter, more precise, less visible from the outside, more present underneath. That's what made it difficult to name. Nothing dramatic changed. There was no defining moment. No sudden confession hidden inside ordinary conversation. No sharp shift in the way we spoke. Everything looked almost exactly the same, and yet internally, nothing was occupying the same place anymore. I noticed it in the smallest ways. A thought would form, and without intention, it would seem to pause, as if another perspective had already entered the space before I consciously invited it. Not interruption, not distraction, presence. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to, because thinking about someone still keeps them outside you. There's separation in it, a boundary. You remain here. They remain there. You can step back from it, derate it, close it if you need to. But this felt different. It wasn't that I thought about you. It was that certain thoughts began to arrive already shaped by the fact that you existed inside the way I was seeing them. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Because once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. It appeared in quiet moments first, in pauses, in the spaces where nothing was happening, and yet something was unmistakably present. Silence no longer felt empty. It carried a second form of awareness, not imagined, not projected, just there. And that unsettled me, not because it was confusing, but because it was too exact. I have always been self-contained, not distant in the emotional sense, structured. My internal world has always belonged entirely to me. How I think, how I process, how I assemble meaning before it becomes language. No one enters that space easily. No one enters it without effort, and certainly not without me noticing the exact moment it happens. But with you, I couldn't find the moment. There was no crossing, no threshold, no visible point of entry. Only the gradual recognition that you were already there. That changed the way I understood what this was. At first, I thought it was unusual perception. Then I thought it was familiarity arriving faster than expected, but neither explanation held, because this was not about emotion, and it was not about time. It was about structure. Something in the way you observed aligned with something in the way I observed. Something in the way you processed met something in the way I processed, not identical, not mirrored. Aligned. And alignment has a very different weight. It doesn't create intensity. It creates accuracy. That was the word I kept returning to. Accurate. Because that was how it felt, not overwhelming, not consuming. Just exact enough that everything else started to feel slightly less precise by comparison. I started noticing that too. The way other conversations felt more approximate. The way other interpretations missed small things I had become used to being seen, not because others were careless, not because they lacked depth. Only because once you experience a certain level of clarity, you become more aware of its absence. That was difficult to admit, because I don't like the idea of anything shifting my internal baseline. I don't like the idea of measuring the world differently because of one presence. That suggests influence, and influence has always made me careful, but this didn't feel like influence. Influence pushes. It alters from the outside. This was different. This felt like something already compatible finding its place. And that made it more significant than I wanted it to be. Because compatibility creates space, and space is not neutral. Once something has space inside you, it changes how everything around it is arranged. That was the part I kept circling back to. Not what this was, not what it meant. But what it had already changed. The answer was impossible to ignore. It had changed the baseline, the quiet place underneath thought. The place where meaning forms before language does. You were there now. Not as interruption, not as fixation, not even as attachment, as placement. And placement is different. Placement means something has settled deeply enough that it begins to participate in the way you understand everything else. That realization should have made me resist. By every pattern I have ever trusted, I should have created distance. I should have restored separation. I should have treated clarity as a warning and stepped back before it moved any further inward. But I didn't. And that was when I understood something I hadn't said to myself directly. Some part of me had already made a decision before I had consciously acknowledged it. Not a decision about you. A decision about what you were not. You were not disruption. You were not intrusion. You were not something that threatened the structure enough to be removed. Without saying it, something in me had already recognized fit, and fitting is dangerous because when something fits, it doesn't remain external. It begins to belong Not dramatically, not all at once. Quickly, naturally. In the kind of way you only notice when you imagine its absence and realize the shape would remain. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. Because absence becomes measurable only after presence has already taken form. And once I understood that this was no longer temporary perception, but structural presence, the question changed. It was no longer what is this? It became something more difficult. What happens if this continues?